When was the last time you got a game over in Deltarune? What about the first time? Do you remember what happened? I think the answers to these questions can provide for us a theory into the capabilities of one of the most enigmatic and ominous characters in the story so far, whose screen time can be measured in seconds rather than the hours we've spent with the others, and that character's image_friend. I'm going to dive deeply into the mechanics of Deltarune's game over, how it works, where we spawn, how the world changes, and why that all links back to the Cheshire Cat of the Dark Worlds, being a creature of determination, who I think might have the full power over the timelines of Deltarune. But first, let's turn back the clock a bit. A little more. Let's go all the way back 10 years to the release of Undertale, because we need to talk about determination. Not the determination of Deltarune, the force with which Lightners can create dark fountains and construct the narratives of the Dark World. No, let's talk about determination. The power, spoilers for Undertale obviously for the rest of the video, which Frisk wields in Undertale to redo events, make different choices, and resurrect from the dead. The power which Flowey uses to trap us in their world, to save and load over our reality, in an attempt to force Frisk and the player to relive their days in the underground over and over again. Determination has always been something a little nebulous in Undertale. The save points tell us that we're filled with it, and we use it to make saves that we can then return to at any time we please. But it's also some sort of injectable matter or energy, extracted from human souls, that can warp living monsters into amalgamates, and in some form resurrect as real as Flowey the Flower. Saving and loading might as well be referred to as time travel in the world of Undertale, and we can see its full power as such in the Omega Flowey fight. Omega Flowey constantly saves and loads save files, rewinding our location to a previous point to disorient and disrupt the player throughout the fight, and attempt to fully undo a timeline where Omega Flowey lost. This is also the only time before Deltarune's release that we saw multiple save files being used, with File 2 being used during the fight, File 3 being used afterwards, and 6 being used to repeatedly reset the soul. This is primarily the form of determination that the title of the video is referencing. This ability to manipulate the timelines in Undertale seems to be an ability of whoever possesses the most determination at any given time. It can't be said for certain one way or another whether determination is still the power which governs the save files in Deltarune, since the only reference to determination we have is from Queen with regards to the creation of the Dark Fountains, a power which Lightners possess, the power of will. But there is a power which governs the save files. A power which fills either Chris or the player and empowers them to manipulate the timelines in the same way Frisk once did. I think that there is evidence that, much like Flowey in Undertale, there are characters in Deltarune which possess this power other than Chris and the player. Two characters, at least, who can utilize Undertale's definition of determination and bend the timelines to their will. One of these two characters is self-evident, the Vessel Creator. Doesn't matter if you believe that disembodied voice to be Gaster or not, they're determination candidate number one. The second is image_friend. Now, instead of diving into these determination candidates right away, let's go through a quick rundown of the parts of Undertale that talk about determination in ways that we care about. The association to saving, loading, and by extension, reversing time. It's also clunky to keep referring to Undertale determination and Deltarune determination separately, and will get confusing when referring to Deltarune's saving and loading power, so for simplicity, let's refer to the ability to manipulate time via saving and loading as Save DT, and Lightner's ability to create dark fountains in Deltarune as Dark DT. For now, we're leaving to the side whether or not Save DT is related to Dark DT in any way in Deltarune, but both are present in the world of Deltarune, with Save DT referring to the Deltarune's ambiguous power referenced by the Deltarune save points. Now, on to what we know about Save DT that we've learned from Undertale. 1. Save DT is a diegetic explanation for saving and loading mechanics. Do you think you were the only one with that power? The power to reshape the world, purely by your own determination. The ability to play God. The ability to save. 2. One user of Save DT can cause others to fail. I thought I was the only one with that power, but I can't save anymore. Apparently your desires for this world override mine. I thought I could frighten you, then steal your soul. I failed. And when I tried to load my save file, it didn't work. Your determination, somehow it's even greater than mine. 3. Multiple save files can coexist in the same continuity. You can see here file 2, 3, and 6 being saved and loaded. 4. Flowey, a creature with the power of save determination, seems to remember everything across resets, excluding a post-truth pacifist true reset, but other characters can only remember vague fragments akin to deja vu. Cinnamon or butterscotch? Wait, do not tell me. Is it cinnamon? Hee hee hee. I had a feeling. Now, we can't say for certain that all of the above is one-to-one true in Deltarune, but let's see what does correlate. 1. Save DT is referred to as an ambiguous power that allows one to save, load, and restore to full HP. Additionally, the save files have ties to a device layer by the Chapter 1 save and load menu, and the quotes and speaking style of the vessel creator. 2. We'll come back to number 2. 3. Multiple save files can coexist, but there's little to say that they exist in the same continuity like they do in the Omega Flowey fight. The individual save files seem to function closer to parallel timelines rather than different snapshots in time that Omega Flowey uses them as. The reason I say that is because of the subtle differences between the save files created in each slot. The drawer is mostly empty, except for a school cross-country shirt with a tear in it, a very old school ID with an embarrassing haircut, a coupon book. Every coupon is for half off a large pizza. All the coupons expire before the book's print date, which would indicate that the save files are more likely to represent separate, ever so slightly different timelines, rather than snapshots of the same timeline. 4. There is one confirmed character whose memory persists past the point of a reset, and that is the vessel creator when they assist you in the fight against the knight. There are other characters whose behavior differs across resets, and I'll start diving into those shortly. We can see from the above 3 points that Save DT seems to behave similarly across Deltarune and Undertale, but Deltarune's presentation of it is skewed in some ways, and investigating just how similar this diegetic saving is across the games is going to take some interrogation of Deltarune's game mechanics. So let's start looking at what exactly happens when you game over in Deltarune. First off, let's look at an expected case. The party runs out of HP, and the game over screen appears, with a quote from Susie or Ralsei if either are present in your party. Declining to continue results in the world being covered in darkness, and we're treated to the haunting Darkness Falls track, one of my favorites on the entire OST, and one that most people will never hear, because who wouldn't select continue on this screen most of the time? Once the track completes, the game either closes or returns to the chapter select screen, depending on your game version. When selecting continue, you return to the last save point you saved at, with the game returning to the state it was in when you saved, with all party members at full HP. No, I will not address that elephant. This is exactly what happens in Undertale as well, minus the ability to select not to continue. A quote plays, and you're resurrected at full HP at the nearest save point. Typical video game behavior. But in Undertale, sometimes dying has an impact on your interactions with other NPCs post-reset. You can quickly flip Metaton's switch, Sans remarks on how many times it looks like you've died, and you can tell Asgore how many times he's killed you. Does Deltarune have any behaviors similar to these? That's a question I set out to answer, so I made a spreadsheet, started dying in every single place I can think of, tallied the results, and learned some very interesting things about how Deltarune and Undertale function under the hood. For starters, I need to define a new term for you, and that term is Temp Save. A temp save is, as the name suggests, a temporary save file that is created not by the player interacting with a save point, but by the game itself. A temp save is all of the data a full player-created save does, complete with all the flags, items, room, game states, etc., but it differs from a full save in that it does not persist when the game is closed. A temp save is only loaded when the player gets a game over, and the temp save is more recent than the most recent full save. Here, let's look at this. In Chapter 2, when the party splits up and Chris is left alone, a temp save is created, so if Chris dies to one of the upcoming solo fights without saving at the cat sign, Chris will reset to the temp save and not have to redo the Birdly mini-boss fight. There are a lot of these temp save points, and from my testing and looking through the code, they most frequently appear at one of the following situations. Someone leaves or joins the party, a puzzle is solved, Chris enters the Dark World, or a difficult fight or sequence is about to happen. I showed you an example of the first situation. For puzzle solving, this situation most frequently comes up in Chapter 2, which is also true of the temp saves in general, as Chapter 2 has the most temp save calls in its codebase, followed closely by Chapter 4, with Chapters 1 and 3 having significantly fewer of them. Each of the mouse puzzles triggers a temp save on completion, as well as all of the box puzzles in Chapter 1, including the rules card quote-unquote puzzles. Every time Chris enters one of the Dark Worlds, a temp save is created, see here in the second Sanctuary. This holds true across all of the Sanctuaries, and the earlier Dark Worlds as well. For the difficult sequences, many of Chapter 4's temp saves take place during the various dangerous climbing sections, especially for each section of the Titan encounter, but by far the funniest use of the temp saves are the two of the very few temp saves in Chapter 3, which are right in front of the two water cooler fights. Dying to either of these will put you back right to before the fight. Looking at these four situations, It's fairly easy to deduce, from a game design perspective, some of the reasons why these temp save points are added. 1. To prevent sequencing issues. I think this is the primary reason why the game temp saves. Especially for the temp saves when Chris enters the Dark World, but also when someone leaves the party or when a puzzle is solved. It's easy to imagine a world where, during game testing, a game over would cause issues if certain parts of the game had to be reset fully, like putting Chris back into the Light World or resetting boxes to their original locations. 2. For player convenience. By the nature of Deltarune's story structure, a lot of temp save points before big bosses or after puzzle solves also come after long story sections. For instance, the temp save which I labeled Queen Feet in my spreadsheet, this temp save existing means that if you happen to walk up the stairs at Queen's Mansion without saving, and die to the fire portraits for instance, you don't have to go all the way through the personalized room, light puzzle, and darkness statue explanation cutscenes, which would be a huge slog. Likewise, you have one right before the first Spamton encounter, which saves the player from having to redo a substantial number of cutscenes where they otherwise wouldn't have had a save point to use. While we're on the topic of player convenience, let's talk about one of the changes that happens fairly frequently during a game over, and that is dialogue skipping. Chapter 2 again has two very good examples of this. The Birdley Coaster fight and the first Spamton encounter again. Watch what happens for both of these boss fights after I've intentionally game overed on each. Know that the Birdley Coaster fight doesn't utilize a temp save system, but it still flags the player as having seen the dialogue and therefore skips the pre-fight cutscene. In my opinion, this doesn't seem to be a diegetic change. By that I mean, when the game does this, I don't think Birdley or Spamton has recognized that they won the fight before and are skipping their interactions purposefully in the fiction of the game. I think these occurrences are purely for the player convenience. I say that because we can look back at Undertale for contrast. There's usually some diegetic lampshading happening, some gag or mentioning of how Chris appears that clues the other characters into the fact that a reset has happened. In Deltarune, it just skips past all of that, and for player convenience shortcuts us to the fight that we found challenging enough to game over to it, with no further changes. That is, most of the time. In a few select instances, Deltarune does give us some diegetic flavoring to go with a reset, and those are why it's been so important to thoroughly establish this base case. Let's start with a couple fun ones, that are strictly not resets. There's no save DT manipulation going on here. Versus Susie and Lancer. In Chapter 1, when fighting the Dark Fun Gang, Susie makes a bet with Chris and Rousey. If they win, Susie and Rousey will join the heroes. If they lose, they'll do whatever Susie says. So what happens when you lose this fight? Lancer laughs, and when you reappear at the spawn point, there's some unique dialogue for a couple more defeats in a row. Of note here is that if you don't save, your HP isn't filled back up either. So there's definitely no saving or loading going on here. Chris and Rousey just get their collective asses thrashed and then retreat from the room. Tennis boards. In Chapter 3, losing a fight while on one of Tennis boards results in Tennis stopping the battle, taking some of your points and setting you back into the game. There's new dialogue if you lost to El Niño and La Niño, but it's clear there's no save DT being used, and the game never saved or loaded. The Party Dojo. Not much to say here. You bypass the game over if your defeat is within the dojo. Nothing unusual here. Now, let's finally address the elephant in the room. Chapter 1. Game overs in Chapter 1 function a little differently from any subsequent chapter. You probably encountered this at the very least when fighting Jevil on your first playthrough of the game. But if that was all the way back in the days of the demo program, you may have forgotten exactly what happened, but the behavior is especially interesting given what happens in Chapter 3. It appears you have reached an end. Will you try again? Then the future is in your hands. And to be clear, this game over screen happens regardless of where you die in Chapter 1, even all the way back to the first hazards you encounter, though dying to them is pretty tedious, and subsequent deaths leave you with a simple "will you persist?" A phrase which will come back again in a bit. Declining will lead to the previously shown sequence of the world being lost to darkness, and accepting will reset the player as shown in the other chapters. The typer value in the code for this text is ID 667, one of the 3 typer IDs used in the vessel creation sequence. The others are ID 666 and ID 2, with 666 being used for the initial "are we connected" messages, and 2 being used when the process is interrupted. The 667 value is what makes the text render in the glowy, pulsing font, and why it's clear that it's the same voice in both instances, with the IDs 666 and 667 being one piece amongst the massive pile of evidence that the voice is old Dr. Gaster. So, in all likelihood, since it's this voice that we're talking to, and is asking if we wish to return to our save point, it's a fair conclusion to make that Gaster is utilizing save DT to reset the timeline back to our save point. Whether it's his save DT which fills us with power, or whether he's invoking the save DT which fills Chris, or whether it's a function of the device which Gaster controls and connects us to this world, it's clear that Gaster's hands are involved, considering his fingerprints are all over the Chapter 1 save slot menu as well. And much like Flowey did, Gaster's memory persists through these resets, seeing as the message to us changes after the first reset to the simple, "Will you persist?" The Roaring Night. Such was clear from just the info we had in Chapter 1, but Chapter 3 pours gasoline on the fire and really hammers home Gaster's direct involvement. Chapter 3 sees the return of Typer ID 667. If you have, on any of your 3 save slots, fought the night before, then a special code handling referred to as Night Mode will trigger, and the vessel creator will offer to reset the fight for you. This includes if you reset your first save file and fight the night again. The vessel creator will modify the point to which you return, hastening your ability to attempt the fight again, and their dialogue will continuously progress and react to the fight, including changing based on whether or not you have the Shadow Mantle equipped or not. Remember when I said we'd come back to whether one user of save DT can cause another's to fail? This is where that becomes relevant. Gaster's control over save DT allows him to reset the timeline to a point in time different from our own save point. He also does it in the same way Omega Flowey does. There's no game over to trigger a resetting of the timeline, since the night doesn't finish us off in the normal progression of time here. He acts as a diegetic way for the soul to attempt an impossible fight in a more convenient way, in a highlighted sequence that far more players will experience than game overing to fights like the Birdley Coaster. Not everyone will see it. It's hidden away for players who naturally would reset to try and see if it's possible, or for players who go out of their way to either find secrets themselves or look them up while doing multiple playthroughs. Meanwhile, those players become less and less likely to game over in the 4 situations where temp saves are created as they become better at the game. Except for 2 places. 2 game overs that I'd wager 99% of completionist players have experienced. 2 places that on repeat playthroughs plenty of people still die to, myself included. Remember when I asked when the last time and the first time you game overed was at the very beginning of the video? I think these 2 spots would top the polls given a wide enough survey of the player base. But before we get to addressing those 2 big elephants in the room, first let's look at some surprise, curveball, diegetic game over changes. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 has 2 places which surprised me greatly in the course of game overing everywhere I could. And these are the main reasons I'm happy I went through the whole game again and tested all of these game overs. These 2 places are 2 of the mini-boss fights, Jackenstein and the Sound of Justice. Both of these fights feature a lengthy preamble before them, including a lot of traversing and walking around, and they're both decently threatening fights. If you die during either of them, this blue fire appears, bearing the text, "The blue flame flickers with the vision of a battle unfinished," which allows you to immediately teleport to the beginning of the fight. These are very unique reactions to game overs, but thankfully I believe the text here already provides us with the intended diegetic explanation. These dark sanctuaries are a place where the prophecy reigns, and so the sanctuaries visiting upon us visions of a battle to come, which had already begun, makes just enough sense to me to allow these to be exceptional game overs in the grand scheme of things. A convenient way for Toby to allow the player to skip some tedium while incorporating an element of this particular dark world. It's not save DT, but it is cool. The 2 elephants. The 2 game overs, the 2 specific rooms, the 2 freak occurrences that spawned this entire video's creation are the fight against John Mantle and the Teacups of Death. If you've never game overed to either of these places, and you've collected all of the shadow crystals, then I don't believe you. These 2 locations have special game over handling that, while not as in-depth as Night Mode, is unique compared to every other game over in the game, and I'd wager have the highest frequency of game overs, other than the fight against the Roaring Night on the first playthroughs, and probably higher for players on repeat playthroughs. Let's go one at a time and talk about why these game overs are so unique. John Mantle. The fight against John Mantle, ERAM, the Mantle Holder, whatever you want to call them, is unique compared to a normal game over and unique compared to game overs elsewhere in the S-rank boards. Normally if you die to an enemy or obstacle on an S-rank board, the game shuts off and Chris puts the controller down. Then, when you turn the game back on, you reset either the beginning or a checkpoint in the game. But in the Mantle fight, Chris is seen taking real damage from ERAM's attacks, and running out of HP triggers a game over, sort of. The soul bursts as normal, but no game over screen appears. Instead, Chris is just placed back at the temp save that was created at the door of the S-rank room. Chris is free to leave, and restarting the S-rank game will put you back in the digital shelter before the ERAM fight, where the dialogue will be skipped, and one other very key change will be made, but I'll get back to that. The Teacups of Death. The teacup room is weird. When you first arrive, walking inside reveals an empty void, and walking back, you can see the doors closed on Chris. Then you have no choice but to wait for a lengthy period of time while the teacups slowly rise to your level. Then you jump in and very slowly descend to the lower level. If you die on the way up, which admit it you have, everyone has, then you'll respawn at a temp save made before the door shuts behind you. From there you can leave as normal, or you can proceed into the room, but regardless, after only a few short moments, the screen will shake and you'll hear a banging sound. That is the sound of the teacups arriving immediately, and this time when you hop in, the descent is nice and snappy, getting you back to the lower level at a much more reasonable speed. This is the biggest tangible difference in the environment itself after a game over, in my opinion a larger difference than the flickering flames in Chapter 4, but unlike Chapter 4, there is no diegetic explanation readily apparent. Now, like I said earlier, with the characters skipping their opening dialogues for repeated fights, not every difference on a reset needs to be diegetic. But this difference is a lot more significant seeming to me compared to some skipped lines, and I think the flames in Chapter 4 indicate that Toby would include a diegetic explanation for a large enough change after a reset, and despite there not being an obvious explanation given, I think this room combined with the John Mantle game over establishes a pattern via one thing that both rooms have in common, and that common thread is an association with image_friend. This is why I spent so long examining and going over every game over I could find in Deltarune. I wanted to be sure these two game overs I noticed are truly unique, because these two game overs are also two of the only places where image friend appears. These are also the only two places where friend appears in which it is possible for the player to game over. Image_friend plays specific roles in both game overs, so let's go over those roles. The more solid of the two is friend's role in the Shadow Mantle boss fight. When you game over against ERAM, there is a pity system in place to make the fight easier and easier on subsequent attempts. Each death adds a multiplier to the drop rate of dark candies, referred to as TV dinners and 10 as boards, but in the code as dark candies. And at 7 deaths allows for multiple dark candies to drop within each phase. And these candies specifically drop from defeating friend-shaped enemies in ERAM's ad phases. But until that first death, not a single dark candy will drop from the friends. This is the reason why, even on subsequent playthroughs where the night might feel fairly trivial at this point, the Shadow Mantle fight is particularly hard to first try. That's because to beat ERAM without dying, you have to do so without a single healing item, which in my opinion is significantly harder than beating the night with the aid of the revivements in Shadow Mantle, though that opinion might be skewed by the number of challenge runs I've done for the night fight. Friend is doling out these healing items in the fight after you've already failed, to make the fight more manageable, continuing to help you more the harder you struggle against the unorthodox boss fight. The second friend-related item on the itinerary is his appearance right before the teacups. Friend's sprite appears briefly before disappearing, right where the teacups will appear, but this only happens on the first instance. After you game over and the room is reset, Friend won't appear, and in their place, the teacups will appear much faster. I think here, once again, image_friend is helping you deal with an unorthodox challenge, helping you reattempt it faster by speeding up the teacups both reaching your level and in transporting you back down to the basement faster. But even if you don't fully buy that, Friend is still opting not to appear on subsequent resets. Friend's absence from the room after the temp save is loaded, and Friend's increasingly potent assistance in the fight against ERAM as the resets are tallied, to me makes one thing abundantly and incontrovertibly true. Friend is able to retain the memories across a save and load. Just like Gaster in Deltarune, just like Flowey in Undertale. I think there are two potential explanations for this. 1. Friend is in some way a servant or assistant of Gaster, and Gaster is instructing Friend based on his own memory retention to aid Chris in these two challenges. I think this explanation is less likely than the final conclusion I'll present, because Gaster has already demonstrated that he is willing to intervene personally, and would simply do as he did in Chapter 1 and 3 if he wished to aid Chris with the Mantle fight and with the teacups. The second explanation is that image_friend has the power of saving and loading, of Undertale's determination, and has or had at one point the ability to alter the timelines and manipulate save DT. Friend is a creature of determination, just like Flowey was in Undertale, and can therefore retain the memories when a player saves and loads, or gets a game over. Whether they can still save and load is more dubious. The game over surrounding the Mantle fight does behave strangely, and bypassing the normal game over screen would make sense if someone else was resetting the timeline with their own save DT instead of Gaster, who would normally. In Undertale, Frisk's determination overrode Flowey's, but there's nothing to say that that has to hold true in Deltarune. Likewise, if Gaster's ability isn't based on save DT, but on some inherent power of the device he created, then Friend may be the only creature capable of doing so. There's a lot of potential combinations to work with here, but it's clear to me that Friend can retain memories of previous resets, and the only power that we're aware of from Undertale or Deltarune to do so is determination.